If you want to become an editor or understand the film that you watch regularly, layer by layer, then this book.
It would be in the blink of an eye.
Walter Murch is one of the most respected film editors of all time.
In the blink of an eye.
And his book, In the Blink of an Eye,
Is in the blink of an eye.
I know you are intelligent enough to listen to this audiobook to enrich your intelligence much more. Don't worry, it's only a movie. Earlier I asked the question, why do cuts work? We know that they do. And yet it is still surprising when you think about it because of the violence of what is actually taking place. At the instant of the cut, there is a total and instantaneous discontinuity of the field of vision. I recall once coming back to the editing room after a few weeks in the mixing theater, where all movements are smooth and incremental, and being appalled at the brutality of the process of cutting. The patient is pinned to the slab and whack, either or, this, not that, in or out. We chop up the poor film in a miniature guillotine and then stick the dismembered pieces together like Dr. Frankenstein's monster. The difference, the miraculous difference, is that out of this apparent butchery, our creation can sometimes gain not only a life, but a soul as well. It is all the more amazing because the instantaneous displacement achieved by the cut is not anything that we experience in ordinary life. We are accustomed to such things, of course. In music, Beethoven was the innovator and master of this, as well as in our own thoughts. The way one realization will suddenly overwhelm everything else, to be, in turn, replaced by yet another. But in the dramatic arts, theater, ballet, opera, there didn't seem to be any way to achieve total instantaneous displacement. Stage machinery can only move so fast, after all. So why do cuts work? Do they have some hidden foundation in our own experience? Or are they an invention that suits the convenience of filmmakers and people have just somehow become used to them? Well, although day-to-day reality appears to be continuous, there is that other world in which we spend perhaps a third of our lives, the night-to-night reality of dreams. And the images in dreams are much more fragmented, intersecting in much stranger and more abrupt ways than the images of waking reality, ways that approximate, at least, the interaction produced by cutting. Perhaps the explanation is as simple as that. We accept the cut because it resembles the way images are juxtaposed in our dreams. In fact, the abruptness of the cut may be one of the key determinants in actually producing the similarity between films and dreams. In the darkness of the theater, we say to ourselves, in effect, this looks like reality, but it cannot be reality because it is so visually discontinuous. Therefore, it must be a dream. Along those lines, it is revealing that the words a parent uses to comfort a child frightened by a nightmare, "Don't worry, darling, it's only a dream," are almost the same words used to comfort a child frightened by a film. "Don't worry, darling, it's only a movie." Frightening dreams and films have a similar power to overwhelm the defenses that are otherwise effective against equally frightening books, paintings, music. For instance, it is hard to imagine this phrase, "Don't worry, darling, it's only a painting." The problem with all this is that the comparison of films and dreams is interesting, probably true, but relatively barren of practical fruits. We still know so little about the nature of dreams that the observation comes to a stop once it has been made. Something to consider, though, is the possibility that there may be a part of our waking reality where we actually do experience something like cuts, and where daylight images are somehow brought in closer, more discontinuous juxtaposition than might otherwise seem to be the case. I began to get a glimmer of this on my first picture editing job, The Conversation, 1974, when I kept finding that Gene Hackman, Harry Caul in the film, would blink very close to the point where I had decided to cut. It was interesting, but I didn't know what to make of it. Then, one morning after I had been working all night, I went out to get some breakfast and happened to walk past the window of a Christian Science reading room where the front page of the monitor featured an interview with John Huston. I stopped to read it, and one thing struck me forcefully because it related exactly to this question of the blink. To me, the perfect film is as though we're unwinding behind your eyes, and your eyes were projecting it themselves so that you were seeing what you wish to see. Film is like thought. It's the closest to thought process of any art. Look at that lamp across the room. Now look back at me. Look back at that lamp. Now look back at me again. Do you see what you did? You blinked. Those are cuts. After the first look, you know that there's no reason to pan continuously from me to the lamp because you know what's in between. Your mind cut the scene. First you behold the lamp, cut. Then you behold me. What Houston asks us to consider is a physiological mechanism, the blink, that interrupts the apparent visual continuity of our perceptions. My head may move smoothly from one side of the room to the other, but in fact, I am cutting the flow of visual images into significant bits, the better to juxtapose and compare those bits, lamp and face in Houston's example, without irrelevant information getting in the way. Of course, there are limits to the kind of juxtapositions I can make this way. I can't jump forward or backward in time and space. That is the prerogative of dreams and films. But even so, the visual displacements available to me just by turning my head from the Grand Canyon in front of me to the forest behind me, or even from one side of this room to the other, are sometimes quite great. After I read that article, I started observing people, watching when they blinked, and I began to discover something much different than what they tell you in high school biology, which is that the blink is simply a means to moisten the surface of the eye. If that's all it is, then for each environment and each individual, there would be a purely mechanical, predictable interval between blinks, depending on the humidity, temperature, wind speed, etc. You would only blink when your eye began to get too dry, and that would be a constant number of seconds for each environment. This is clearly not the case. People will sometimes keep their eyes open for minutes at a time. At other times, they will blink repeatedly, with many variations in between. The question then is, what is causing them to blink? On the one hand, I'm sure you've all been confronted by someone who was so angry that he didn't blink at all. This is a person, I believe, in the grip of a single thought that he holds, and that holds him, inhibiting the urge and need to blink. And then there is the opposite kind of anger that causes someone to blink every second or so. This time, the person is being assailed simultaneously by many conflicting emotions and thoughts, and is desperately but unconsciously using those blinks to try to separate these thoughts, sort things out, and regain some kind of control. So it seems to me that our rate of blinking is somehow geared more to our emotional state and to the nature and frequency of our thoughts than to the atmospheric environment we happen to find ourselves in. Even if there is no head movement, as there was in Houston's example, the blink is either something that helps an internal separation of thought to take place, or it is an involuntary reflex accompanying the mental separation that is taking place anyway. And not only is the rate of blinking significant, but so is the actual instant of the blink itself. Start a conversation with somebody and watch when they blink. I believe you will find that your listener will blink at the precise moment he or she gets the idea of what you're saying, not an instant earlier or later. Why would this be? Well, speech is full of unobserved grace notes and elaborations, the conversational equivalents of dear sir and yours sincerely. And the essence of what we have to say is often sandwiched between an introduction and a conclusion. The blink will take place either when the listener realizes our introduction is finished and that now we are going to say something significant, or it will happen when he feels we are winding down and not going to say anything more significant for the moment. And that blink will occur where a cut could have happened had the conversation been filmed, not a frame earlier or later. So we entertain an idea or a linked sequence of ideas, and we blink to separate and punctuate that idea from what follows. Similarly, in film, a shot presents us with an idea or a sequence of ideas, and the cut is a blink that separates and punctuates those ideas. At the moment you decide to cut, what you are saying is, in effect, I am going to bring this idea to an end and start something new. It is important to emphasize that the cut by itself does not create the blink moment. The tail does not wag the dog. If the cut is well placed, however, the more extreme the visual discontinuity, from dark interior to bright exterior, for instance, the more thorough the effect of punctuation will be. At any rate, I believe filmic juxtapositions are taking place in the real world not only when we dream, but also when we are awake. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that these juxtapositions are not accidental mental artifacts, but part of the method we use to make sense of the world. We must render visual reality discontinuous. Otherwise, perceived reality would resemble an almost incomprehensible string of letters without word separation or punctuation. When we sit in the dark theater, then we find edited film a surprisingly familiar experience, more like thought than anything else, in Huston's words. Dragnet. If it is true that our rates and rhythms of blinking refer directly to the rhythm and sequence of our inner emotions and thoughts, then those rates and rhythms are insights into our inner selves, and therefore as characteristic of each of us as our signatures. So if an actor is successful at projecting himself into the emotions and thoughts of a character, his blinks will naturally and spontaneously occur at the point that the character's blinks would have occurred in real life. 9. I believe this is what I was finding with Hackman's performance in The Conversation. He had assumed the character of Harry Call was thinking a series of Harry's thoughts the way Harry would think them, and therefore was blinking in rhythm with those thoughts. And since I was absorbing the rhythms he was giving me and trying to think similar thoughts myself, my cut points were naturally aligning themselves with his blink points. In a sense, I had rerouted my neural circuitry so that the semi-involuntary command to blink caused me instead to hit the stop button on the editing machine. To that same end, one of the disciplines I follow is to choose the out point of a shot by marking it in real time. If I can't do this, if I can't hit that same frame repeatedly at 24 frames per second, I know there is something wrong in my approach to the shot, and I adjust my thinking until I find a frame I can hit. I never permit myself to select the out point by inching back and forth, comparing one frame with another to get the best match. That method, for me at any rate, is guaranteed to produce a rhythmic tone deafness in the film. Anyway, another one of your tasks as an editor is this sensitizing of yourself to the rhythms that the good actor gives you, and then finding ways to extend these rhythms into territory not covered by the actor himself, so that the pacing of the film as a whole is an elaboration of those patterns of thinking and feeling. And one of the many ways you assume those rhythms is by noticing, consciously or unconsciously, where the actor blinks. There's a way of editing that ignores all of these questions, what I would call the dragnet system, from the 1950s TV series of the same name. The policy of the show seemed to be to keep every word of dialogue on screen. When someone had finished speaking, there was a brief pause and then a cut to the person who was now about to talk. And when he in turn finished speaking, there was a cut back to the first person who nodded his head or said something. And then when that person was finished, they cut back again, etc. It extended to single words. Have you been downtown yet? Cut. No. Cut. When are you going downtown? Cut. Tomorrow. Cut. Have you seen your son? Cut. No. He didn't come home last night. Cut. What time does he usually come home? Cut. 2 o'clock. At the time, when it first came out, this technique created a sensation for its apparently hard-boiled police blotter realism. The dragnet system is a simple way to edit, but it is a shallow simplicity that doesn't reflect the grammar of complex exchanges that go on all the time in even the most ordinary conversations. If you're observing a dialogue between two people, you will not focus your attention solely on the person who is speaking. Instead, while that person is still talking, you will turn to look at the listener to find out what he thinks of what is being said. The question is, when exactly do you turn? There are places in a conversation where it seems we almost physically cannot blink or turn our heads since we are still receiving important information, and there are other places where we must blink or turn away in order to make better sense of what we have received. And I would suggest that there are similar points in every scene where the cut cannot or must occur, and for the same reasons. Every shot has potential cut points, the way a tree has branches, and once you have identified them, you will choose different points depending on what the audience has been thinking up to that moment and what you want them to think next. For instance, by cutting away from a certain character before he finishes speaking, I might encourage the audience to think only about the face value of what he said. On the other hand, if I linger on the character after he finishes speaking, I allow the audience to see, from the expression in his eyes, that he is probably not telling the truth, and they will think differently about him and what he said. But since it takes a certain amount of time to make that observation, I cannot cut away from the character too early. Either I cut away while he is speaking, branch number 1, or I hold until the audience realizes he is lying, branch number 2. But I cannot cut in between those two branches. To do so would either seem too long or not long enough. The branch points are fixed organically by the rhythm of the shot itself and by what the audience has been thinking up to that moment in the film. 10, but I am free to select one or the other of them, or yet another one further on, depending on what realization I want the audience to make. In this way, you should be able to cut from the speaker to the listener and vice versa in psychologically interesting, complex, and correct patterns that reflect the kinds of shifts of attention and realization that go on in real life. In this way, you establish a rhythm that counterpoints and underscores the ideas being expressed or considered. And one of the tools to identify exactly where these cut points, these branches may be, is to compare them to our patterns of blinking, which have been underscoring the rhythm of our thoughts for tens of thousands, perhaps millions of years of human history. Where you feel comfortable blinking, if you are really listening to what is being said, is where the cut will feel right. So there are really 3 problems wrapped up together. 1, identifying a series of potential cut points, and comparisons with the blink can help you do this. 2, determining what effect each cut point will have on the audience. And 3, choosing which of those effects is the correct one for the film. I believe the sequence of thoughts, that is to say, the rhythm and rate of cutting, should be appropriate to whatever the audience is watching at the moment. The average real-world rate of blinking is somewhere between the extremes of 4 and 40 blinks per minute. If you are in an actual fight, you will be blinking dozens of times a minute because you are thinking dozens of conflicting thoughts a minute. And so when you're watching a fight in a film, there should be dozens of cuts per minute. In fact, statistically, the 2 rates of real-life blinking and of film cutting are close enough for comparison. Depending on how it is staged, a convincing action sequence might have around 20 cuts a minute, whereas a dialogue scene would still feel normal in an American film, averaging 6 cuts per minute or less. You should be right with the blinks, perhaps leading them ever so slightly. I certainly don't expect the audience to blink at every cut. The cut point should be a potential blink point. In a sense, by cutting by this sudden displacement of the visual field, you are blinking for the audience. You achieve the immediate juxtaposition of 2 concepts for them, what they achieve in the real world by blinking, as in Houston's example. Your job is partly to anticipate, partly to control the thought processes of the audience, to give them what they want and or what they need just before they have to ask for it, to be surprising yet self-evident at the same time. If you are too far behind or ahead of them, you create problems. But if you are right with them, leading them ever so slightly, the flow of events feels natural and exciting at the same time.